About 101, and we have a bunch of people joining us. This is the 8th webinar in the GREW project's last couple years. And the title today is, Are They Still Farming? Insights into Conducting Long-Term Evaluation of a Beginning Farmer Training Program. And first, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Katie Trazo. I'm a program associate with the GREW project and also support the Virginia Beginning Farmer and Rancher Coalition. And we have Jan Perez here as well, who's the program director of the GREW project out of UCSC. And today we're supporting this webinar and will be available to support in any way with technical logistics. And just to share a little bit about that, you can contact Jan in the chat if you have any technical issues. We also just wanted to remind everyone that we have folks placed on mute automatically and just ask you to keep it that way to reduce noise. We also want to let you know that closed captions are available. We have the automatic closed captioning turned on. And so that's an option you can click on. It's a CC button, and you can either pull it up as subtitles, or you can have it as a full transcript that shows up in the right-hand column, kind of similar to the chat feature. And we invite you to add questions in the chat box today for our talk. We'll have time at the end to answer any discussion questions that you have, and also invite you to share any clarifying questions you have throughout the talk, and we may be able to interrupt the speakers to have those answered. And we also just wanted to remind you the session's being recorded today, and we will post it on the GREW website once that is complete and ready. So first, the GREW project, most of you all are familiar with it at this point, but it stands for Gaining Results Through Evaluation Work. And it's really a project that's here to support beginning farmer training programs in their evaluation efforts. We have a few outcomes we're working towards, but really just making evaluation accessible, efficient, and useful, and helping these organizations do more evaluation and improve their efforts. So we have a lot of different activities that we do to support those outcomes. We have a lot of tools on our website. We offer these webinars, and we also offer learning communities. So today, our webinar, when we pull together these webinars, we're really showing either the basics of evaluation, which we have a lot of those in our archives, or we're providing unique examples from beginning farmer programs on the grounds. So today, that's what we will be sharing. We have Tufts new entry program here sharing about long-term evaluation. Our presenters today are Kevin Cody, who's a professor of practice in food systems and a farmer training program manager at New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. So in addition to managing the farmer training program at New Entry, Kevin is the inaugural Hawk Cunningham Professor of Practice in Food Systems at Tufts University. He does both training and educating of farmers and also food systems leaders at the center. And the goal is to really bring about sustainable food systems transformation. Jennifer Hashley is the director of the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. She also serves on boards of Urban Farming and the Carrot Project, and is a farm business planning instructor for the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. Jennifer and her husband also have started a successful pasture-based livestock operation called Pete and Jen's Backyard Birds, and she served as an agricultural Peace Corps volunteer as well in Honduras. And Jennifer has a master's in agricultural policy from Tufts, and also a bachelor's in environmental science and public policy from Indiana University. And before we pass it off to Kevin and Jennifer, we want to do land acknowledgement. We have 3 institutions that are sponsoring this program today, the University of Santa Cruz, Tufts University, and Virginia Tech. And we wanted to take a moment to really honor the traditional custodians of the lands in which these institutions reside. And that includes the Awaswas speaking tribe, or the Awaswas speaking Yupi tribe, in California, the Massachusetts people, and the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag tribes up at Tufts, and the Monacan and Tutelo people of Virginia Tech. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and at this point, I will pass it over to Kevin to share his slides, and Kevin and Jennifer will take it over from here.
All right, we there?
Yep, that looks great, Kevin.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. Thanks for this opportunity. And yeah, glad to be here. Glad to see some familiar faces in the audience, and look forward to hearing from folks too about some of their experience. We will have a couple of questions pop up throughout the presentation for you to answer in the chat. And like you said, any clarifying questions, definitely put in the chat as well. And we'll pause along the way. And we'll also try to save some time at the end for a little bit more open-ended conversation. Sorry how dark I am. It's really bright in this room. I don't know what's going on. So I am going to kind of get us started here, and then I'll also turn to Jennifer in moments to help add some context for the evaluation work that we've been doing more recently, and how we came to the point where we're at now with our evaluation of our incubator farmer training program. So just a couple of fun graphics, maybe to start us off. I'll let you take a minute here and laugh to yourself. We sometimes don't have all the numbers we wish we had to say what we feel we know about our programs. And I think one of the lessons that we'll talk about today is really trying to quantify and qualify some of the experiences of folks who have come through our training program, so that we can feel more confident in talking about the results and the impacts that we've had. And then whoever Lord Kelvin is said something that gets thrown around a lot too: if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And I think just in the spirit of evaluation and thinking about especially long-term outcomes, this might sound relatively simple, but when you're trying to understand the impact of a program on a participant, or how a participant has fared in the world as a result of your program and training, excuse me, maybe 5, 10 plus years post-programming, this measurement becomes a lot more challenging. So what are we even measuring when we measure success? And are we measuring it from the program perspective, which is what I'll talk mostly about today? In other words, is our program successful in meeting its desired outcomes? But our program is about training beginning farmers. And so a subtext there is, well, what is a successful farm? For some of our participants, success is not making 100% of their livelihood from their farming endeavors. Success might be framed as being able to continue to farm so that they could supplement their job and do what they really love to do, which is grow food and support their community with food that they want to grow. Another question that we grappled with here is, how do you measure success over time? And for folks who have done logic models, which we'll talk about ours today, you'll recognize that some of the outcomes are based on kind of short-term gains, or we've measured that in terms of 1 to 3 years, or maybe even time on the incubator. And then maybe midterm outcomes, which for us is maybe 2 to 4 or even 5 years after the incubator, and 5 years plus. And those outcomes that we would like to see as a result of their participation are going to look different across time. And so when we're going out to do an evaluation of this program, how do we sort of separate those different outcomes and acknowledge that even though we might capture a moment in time with our survey, it's a lot harder to extrapolate on success over a longer period of time. And we'll get into sort of one approximation or way we've been able to try to do that. So a quick question for the chat. How do you measure success? Are there one or two things that you could put into a chat right now that for the work that you're doing, and I'm going to assume that many of us, if not all of us, are involved in some kind of work that needs to be evaluated, whether or not it's related to farmer training. And what are some of the varieties of measurements that we could use to measure success in those programs? Feel free anytime to add that in there, and we'll stop and maybe try to capture some of that feedback as we go. And this isn't just an opportunity to kind of engage folks. I'm genuinely curious. How are we measuring success? You know, for us, time spent farming is one of those key measurements, but I think it's actually a somewhat limited one, even though it's a very significant. I wanted to just start off by kind of putting out there a few of the lessons that I think that we've taken away from our evaluation efforts. One is preparation. The time we've spent just collecting the records of who was involved in our programming at what point in time, and acknowledging, you know, that some of those records needed to be updated and the contact information was woefully out of date for a lot of them, was a huge factor, actually, and one of the more time-consuming elements of this process. Just wanted to reach back out in the chat, and just something Cameron said, right? Is the farmer meeting their income goals or whatever they define those to be? And I think in terms of success and measurements, I would be interested to know too if folks have really found ways to measure success based on what the farmer says means to them, which I think is a really kind of useful way of framing some of this work. But to go back to preparation for a second, so keeping good records, reviewing the available resources. I'll give a shout out to GRU and some of the resources that they've developed through this project, which we found immensely valuable. And really finding a team to support you in this work, because it can be a lot of work. Having others that are dedicated to it to support an individual who might be playing a lead role is a hugely valuable. Being very persistent. Persistence was key, not just in our own motivation to do the work, but it also reaching out to respondents, to getting folks to take a survey, and, you know, allowing and acknowledging that this process can take time. And you'll see in a timeline slide here in a second that this has been quite a process for us. And it still is, it's ongoing. Another lesson, which is a little bit harder to frame, but I'm just referring to as sort of perspective, is that in this moment of doing the evaluation, it's given us perspective and looking back on what, not just what are some of the outcomes of our participants, but also on how have we gone about collecting information and using that information as an organization to inform our program. So looking back can be about just sort of program and participant outcomes, but also organizationally, what have we done in the past in collecting data from participants, and what makes this project different, and we'll talk about that as well. So in other words, knowing why you're doing something. And I think for us, in part, that has to do with wanting to improve the incubator farm that we've operated for so many years now, and thinking about this information that we've collected as a way of really informing what the future of the program might look like. So the next few slides are going to provide a little bit more context with our programs and timeline. So you'll see kind of how we've broken apart this work, and we're not trying to do an evaluation of everything new entry related, but rather really focused on one element of this. This is kind of a clunky graphic, but hopefully it does reveal a lot about new entry in one glance. The program descriptions here in the center. These are some of the courses and ongoing programs that we offer. This is specific to our farmer training programs. And the Explore Farming workshop, for example, is a 2-hour-long workshop that it's offered every other month or so. That gets the largest number of participants over the course of 1 year. So you'll see that in our crop production course, we still get a large number of individuals, but slightly fewer than what might come about in our Explore Farming workshop. This crop production course is offered over the summer, about 15 weeks in 3 different sessions on basic horticulture skills. We also offer a farm business planning class twice over the winter months on financial planning. And again, usually a little bit fewer, although the numbers there switched a little bit. And then our farm incubator, even fewer individuals, but if you look below that arrow line, in each of these cases, we're suggesting that the impact of those programs is arguably larger over that period, right? Because it's not the case that everyone necessarily goes from one to another. So even though the number of participants in some of these programs decreases as we move along this kind of pipeline, the impact arguably increases. And our goal here, in part, was to see, is that accurate? Right? What has been the impact of our farm incubator, for example, which is what we're going to talk about and what we focused on for our evaluation. So at the very top here, you can see some of these ongoing services with our food hub, which has its own probably logic model that we can talk about, technical assistance and workshops. The program descriptions here in the center I focused on as the farmer training program manager. Our land access and transition work has kind of been shifted over the years to whereas now our primary focus is on referring individuals to organizations that are more explicitly about land access and transition. And then I'll just say at the very bottom of this graphic too, you can see kind of what our objectives are in each of these programs and what we hope the impacts would be. This to me, and I'm looking to Jan virtually in a way, strikes me as something more like what we would see in a theory of change, in part because it attempts to understand how an organization approaches change for its mission or its vision over time. Unlike at least how we've interpreted the logic model, which could apply to an organization, but you'll see here in a second, our logic model is specific to our incubator farm program, which is what we've decided to focus on for a variety of reasons, and I think Jennifer can talk more about that in a second. This is a slide that harkens back to kind of earlier efforts to collect information from our business class alumni. So I'm going to turn it to Jennifer for a second to provide a little bit more context about how new entry has collected information in the past, primarily from this subset of individuals that have participated in our program. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, and thanks everybody for joining us. Kevin, it might be useful if you want to flip back to the other slide, but just before you do that, I would say that, we used to kind of not be really clear, like when somebody asks us, if a funder asks us, how many farmers do you serve and what's your success rate? We end up looking at this graphic and being like, well, which farmer subset do you mean? Is it the number of people that just come through a training workshop one time? You know, what number is our N, I guess, for the population size that I should respond to that question from? So in the past, in order to get like the greatest number of people that have come through our program that we felt like had real meaning, we would usually survey annually all of our business planning course graduates. So, you know, that is kind of the flagship program that opens the door to the incubator and the food hub and a long-term relationship that we have with that farmer over time. So we used to do an annual program evaluation to check in, or we called it our annual farmer alumni evaluation of all of our business planning course graduates, which, you know, can be substantial, is around 400 plus people over the last few years. The last time we did it was in 2018 for 2017 data, which is the information that you saw on the slide, because we felt like that was the most representative of all the people that we worked with, because some people would come to us through the business planning course that already had access to land. Maybe they were a livestock farmer. Maybe they wanted to do some other enterprise other than vegetables. So they took part in the class. They had multiple points of contact. They stayed in touch with us. They might have participated in the food hub or received ongoing technical assistance, but they didn't end up on the incubator necessarily, not everyone out of that 500 plus group. So we would ask this annual survey, have a lot of different questions on it about their individual goals. Did they meet their goals? Are they still farming? What supports do they need? What were their major market outlets? What challenges were they having? Just to get a sense to kind of continually provide input and feedback on where we could develop new programming, where people were, you know, having success or struggling, and it kind of informs some of our program development. But over time, again, the response rate, we were really just catching mostly the people that were recent graduates of the business planning course. It was a requirement for people to complete this annual survey if they were participating in the food hub or the incubator, because those were the carrots, right? If you want access to land on the incubator, or you want to sell to the food hub, we ask that you complete this annual survey. But we really weren't getting a lot of maybe super useful data, because we would get maybe a 10% response rate from anyone who'd ever taken the business planning course going back 20 years. So that was just some of the history of how we used to do a lot of evaluation. Of course, we do individual program level evaluation for each of the courses and workshops that we offer, but this is our more global kind of look back on what we call our alumni, and you know, they're off in the world, and what are they still doing? So, which is different from this kind of deeper dive evaluation. So Kevin, if you want to take it back from here.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. You know, it is different, right? And so I think the evaluation objectives could vary based on your audience and your programming. So these are the objectives that we took forward based on a decision to essentially say, okay, we've been trying to understand the business class participants or alumni, and what's as a proxy for a lot of the other work that we've done. And basically with this project focused just on the incubator as one of these higher level programs that ought to have maybe the most significant kind of impact, because it's where we have the most engagement with an individual. They're on the farm, the incubator, for 1 to 3 years, and we can really sort of I think play a more significant role, arguably, in their future trajectory as a result of that kind of engagement. So some of the questions here: is the program meeting its desired objectives? And I'll show you what some of those are through our logic model. What are some of the challenges and opportunities for the program and for the alumni, right? For those incubator farmers who have gone off into the world. We wanted to take this as an opportunity to actually revise our logic model and our programming, knowing that these ought to be somewhat dynamic. Lastly, we're hoping that we could extrapolate, not in a generalizable way, because we have a relatively small data set, on the state of beginning farmers and incubators based on using New Entry's incubator essentially as a case study. So again, it's not meant to represent a generalizable sample of all beginning farmers and incubators, but New Entry as a case study is unique in that it's been around for a long time. It's helped inform a lot of the work that's gone on in this space, and having a really clear idea about what's been the impact of this program, I think ought to be or could be beneficial for informing the field more broadly. What would be your objective? Maybe you already have one. Maybe you've already done this. I think an relatively easy objective might be like, are we meeting our desired goals, right? Which I think is a nice, pretty clean way of thinking about evaluation. But there are certainly others. And I'd be curious if you want to add in the chat, what might be some of your objectives? And I'll let Jan maybe moderate, and feel free, Jan, to pop in any time too, if you want to kind of highlight some of those responses as they come in.
I would say, Kevin, Gabby had a great question. If you would say that the values of the organization are reflected on the assessment of impact and how we defined our evaluation objectives and goals.
I think so. And let's see, if I'm hoping the next state or the slide might be a logic model that could highlight some of that. Because I think in that logic model, which we use as a framework for guiding some of our evaluation questions, ought to be a sense of who we are as an organization, what values we bring to the table, based on those things that we want to see happen, right? Our desired objectives, I think, are very much related to our values, in other words. So we're not quite there. I think it's the next slide. I'll show the very exciting logic model, building this up. This is kind of a quick snapshot of our timeline. What I really want to highlight here is that we started this project essentially in the fall of 2019. Right now it's 2 years later. We took a bit of a time off in between, but in the fall of 2019, we really were looking back at that alumni data from our business class that Jennifer talked about and saying, well, what do we really make of this? And is this really allowing us to fully understand the impact we're having and how we might modify our programs in the future? And I think while there were glimpses of information in there that were really valuable, it was hard to make sense of it as a whole and to think about it in terms of these evaluation metrics. So our decision then was to say, okay, let's just focus on our incubator. We've got a smaller number of individuals, therefore we could probably get more people to respond, and we could be more proactive about getting those responses. And it's a program that we think could have one of the greater impacts of the different types of programs or courses that we operate. In that same time period, I was working with a group of students who compiled a lot of the resources from the GRU library that's posted on the New Entry webpage, which were incredibly valuable at helping us revise then a logic model that had taken shape mostly for grant funders, but we decided to really kind of build out a logic model that's for us to think about how we think about our program. We took that as an opportunity to look at some of the desired outcomes as well. At that point, we basically put this internal evaluation on pause for about a year. Jennifer, do you want to talk just briefly about the VFRDP application that went out around that time?
Yeah, so in that time period as well, in the spring of 2020, early 2020, pre-pandemic, but in that fall period, we had been working with our partners in the NIFTY network, the National Incubator Farm Training Initiative, which is now transforming into the Field Network, which is combining our incubator and apprenticeship networks, but had been talking about wanting to do more outcome evaluation across incubator projects. So we had been thinking about this, other folks were thinking about this, and so we had spent some time planning fall into winter that year around writing the beginning farmer and rancher development proposal to the USDA for an educational enhancement grant to do some training of trainer and some funding for other incubator projects for many of us, for 5 or 6 of us, to do at least a 5 to 10 year look back of our outcomes. So we were going to design a collective evaluation instrument tool that we could all use. We were going to try to establish some benchmarks across programs, do some peer mentoring. So we kind of put our own initial planning efforts on pause as we were collaborating with other groups across the country to develop this shared proposal and hoping that it would bring resources to the table so that we could work on something collectively together. And as you can probably imagine, based on the timeline, we didn't get funded for that project, unfortunately. So we didn't find that out until the summer of later summer 2020 last year, after the pandemic started and all that other stuff. So we picked back up the pieces of doing our own program evaluation last fall, because we sort of wanted to pause and make sure we were doing it in collaboration, so that if we were going to go through this process, we could do it collectively with other incubator projects and kind of norm some of the evaluation instruments and the processes, and do this as a collective body and be able to say something more. But so it goes. Not every proposal is successful, so hence the pause.
And I added that here, and I think it's important to think about the context in which we operate and sometimes do this work, both as a part of grant funding and perhaps independent of, God forbid, the grant funding that often drives a lot of the programming. And so if you can find ways to really make this project kind of stand on its own, I think that's going to help ensure that you can have some follow through. And so in some ways, I'm glad that we didn't, not that that project didn't get funded, but that this project overall, you know, although we're happy to kind of be working with GRU on it, it doesn't necessarily have kind of other ties to specific funding objectives, right? And that allows us to be a little bit more focused, I think. So fall of 2020, we get back into the mode. I worked with a new set of students, actually one in particular who helped really sort of assemble the information about who we're trying to contact, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a long process because we went back to 2005 for this. And so project went from 2005 to 2020. Fast forward a little bit, in the spring of summer of 2021, we did go through an IRB, or institutional review board process, because I would like to eventually make this data published in a way that does attempt to generalize on and add knowledge to the field, beginning farmer training and incubators. And then we launched our survey tool that was developed in part through the compilation of resources and the evaluation design work we did earlier that year. We launched our survey in April of this year. Over the summer, we pinged people 1,000 times to take the survey with reminders, texts, and phone calls. And then we also conducted a focus group after we closed the survey, at which, at the end of that survey, folks could indicate if they're interested in a focus group. A number of them did, and we held that focus group over the summer.
I'll just add, while Kevin's transitioning to the next slide, if you are planning to publish the data and you are affiliated with an institution, we have plenty of time to go through the institutional review board process. Again, I'm not sure April, which is generally seems to be the time in our history that we seem to put out surveys to farmers, because it's when we get through our winter rush of conferences and workshops and things and get excited about the next year, but it's not the best timing for farmers to be responding to surveys when they're out busy in the field scrambling to get ready for the season. So I think the timing of when you institute and administer your survey is key.
Yeah, our goal was a January, February launch for the survey. So we had to push it back a couple of months, largely because of the timeline around the IRB. That's another story. This is the infamous logic model. This is a document that I think we view as a living document where some of the inputs and outputs might be relatively consistent, but as a result of doing things like this evaluation, we might want to revisit some of the desired outcomes. What do we want to see happen as a result of what we do? Not just because we want to tailor those outcomes to what we see happening, but because those evaluation measurements can inform, I think, our outcomes and help us steer us in a direction where we might have the greatest impact. The survey that we administered touched on short-term, mid-term, and long-term, although we did want to focus on those long-term outcomes, and which we'll revisit at the end of this presentation. But you can see here, transformation of local and regional food systems is a hard thing to measure. Resilience in food systems is a hard thing to measure. So one thing I'll flag here as somewhat of a lesson learned is be thinking about measurement tools as you're developing or revising that logic model, and how a survey instrument, for example, could capture those outcomes, or what questions you would use to approximate an answer to those outcomes, or the answer to the question, have we achieved these desired outcomes? A useful tool that we used in thinking about some of these outcomes, especially over the long term, is one that was developed by GRU that has this really nice nested view of outcomes across these different levels, right? An individual, an organization, community, society. And I think it's been brought up in the literature from folks involved with GRU and elsewhere that it's well recognized that long-term outcomes are really difficult to measure. Not just because there might be a lot of distance between where a person was when they were in a program that you provided and where they are now, but it typically has to do with bigger picture goals. And I think inherent in that is the necessity to sort of frame questions and measurement tools that, again, can serve as an approximation for addressing things like, community food security or ecological services or ag literacy at the community level, and different types of engagement. So we attempted to address some of these issues through questions and on our survey related to things like social networking and how many points of connection farmers had to agricultural service providers and to other farmers. But I wanted to flag this as a great resource to keep in mind if this is something you're thinking about. Our design, I would say, is relatively straightforward with certain caveats. The overall population that we put into our design were incubators that completed the program, incubator farmer graduates from 2005 to 2020. And then that's our sort of total population, but the sample that we were referring to now as our N was 52, because 8 of those 60 had neither phone or email addresses that we just determined were up to date. So basically, we didn't have contact information for 8 of those individuals. And so we basically referred to our sample now of that population as 52. But as Jennifer can tell you, the incubator, or to some extent new entry, or to a large extent new entry, had been around before 2005, but they aren't in this population. Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, and the reason we decided to stop there, it's a nice round number, right? Let's do a 15-year look back, but also the program was quite different from 1998 until 2007. So we also wanted to pick a point in time that was consistent in terms of how we communicated what the program was, like what was the incubator. This terminology kind of changes over time. Like we didn't used to call our food hub a food hub. We used to call it a marketing cooperative, our marketing collaborative, our marketing program. And our incubator farm program didn't used to be called an incubator. There wasn't a set time that we said you're going to come into the program and you have to leave in 3 years. That started developing in 2005. So we also just wanted to be sure that we were measuring a sample size where participants coming into the program knew what the expectations of the program were. And prior to 2005, we called it a training farm program. Like we didn't know that we were going to eventually, develop 3 or 4 different incubator farm properties and then not want to keep on, in order to continue to grow the program and train more farmers, have to keep developing new farms, as that's very capital intensive and expensive and challenging to manage. So we had to kind of change the model to be like, we can manage maybe these 3 or 4 farm sites, but that means we actually have to graduate people off eventually. So that's the point in time in 2005 where it was clear that we had a transitioning farmer program and that anyone coming in beyond that point was going to need to, transition off the land in 3 years. So that's kind of how we define that period of time as making the most sense when we're doing this look back, because we have 40 plus other people who've been on the land since we started as an organization, but chasing down 100 people, 40 of them who, probably didn't understand that that was the goal, didn't seem appropriate.
And what it is you're evaluating, I think that if the programs change over time, which as they almost all certainly do to an extent, a long-term evaluation needs to maybe just at least internally achieve some clarity around like, well, what constitutes the program that we want to evaluate starting when? And this was the point, I think, where folks could be on the land and have that greater access to land for a full year, and then starting that transition process in 1 to 3 years post incubator, that we decided made the most sense for where to kind of draw the boundary around our population. Our survey, again, was used compiling information that we gleaned from other surveys, including from CASPAS and Vivo Farms. And we launched it again in April. It was open until beginning of July. We sent emails and through different means, through our MailChimp and through individual email addresses. I sent certain emails. We had Jennifer sending certain emails because she's been a constant and is probably recognizable to all the folks who are in that population, unlike myself. I've been with New Entry for 2.5 years. But we also did phone calls and we also did text messages. Ultimately, we got a 50% response rate, which for us is pretty remarkable. I think our highest, at least that I was familiar with prior to this point, would be in the mid-30s, which would still be considered decent in some cases. So a 50% response rate was actually our target, and we met it. We did a focus group as well this summer, which I won't talk a lot about, but I will say it was really inspiring, and it added a degree of texture to the data that we haven't fully incorporated, and we're not going to report on here because it's in process, but that I found really meaningful. And so, one note here, 13 people expressed interest, but only 5 people attended a focus group for which they got paid $100. Sort of surprising that we didn't get more people to attend. This phrase, texture of social practice, is one that I forgot that I had added in there. It's from Arun Agarwal and some of his work on governmentality, if there's any academic nerds in there. Curious, your highest survey response rate percent. Put that in the chat. I'm going to, in the spirit of time, or the lack thereof, go through these pretty quickly. Jan got 60%, dang, that's pretty good. Because I do want to leave some time for us to talk about some of these things towards the end of their presentation. So forgive me if I go through these slides quickly. First off, one of the questions we asked, was this your goal to continue operating a farm business? We can't assume that that was 100%, and it wasn't. 79% of individuals said that was their goal, but for some it wasn't. And that was because the incubator helped them understand that maybe this wasn't for them, or this wasn't the right time for them to start a farm business. So big reveal now. So quick glance, still farming by percentages. At the time of the survey, 54% currently operated a farm business. So that's our snapshot. 75% operated a farm business for any amount of time post incubator. So that's another kind of snapshot still, right? It's still a glimpse into time. But we also wanted to know, well, what about over time? Because it's not enough to know that somebody farmed, but for how long did they farm? So what we did is we averaged the number of years post incubator divided by the number of years farming for those who were still farming, which was 18, or for those who responded yes to this 75%, the number is 18. So for those individuals, the years post farming divided by the years farming, and then took an average of that. 74% is the average time farming post incubator for those who operated a farm business for any amount of time. which is interesting, I think. But when we break that down by the number of years post-incubator to get a little bit more granular, for those who are 1 through 5, years 1 through 5 post-incubator, 96% were still farming, which is pretty remarkable. So up to year 5, pretty much everyone's still farming out there. Notice the ends here too, going down. In years 6 through 8, our N is only 6, and it goes down by half, less than that, 44% farming in years 6 through 8, and then a smaller number, but a higher percentage of years 10 through 13. Again, this is years post-incubator. So if you're 10 years post-incubator, up to 13 years post-incubator, 3 individuals fit that category who responded to our survey. 83% of them that's the average time spent farming among that cohort. The questions that this brought up for us is sort of, well, who's missing from this survey? Who's not responding to this survey for whatever reason? And how do we test to see if the survey responses reveal a certain bias about who's responding? Because if we're asking incubator farmer alumni to answer this survey, a lot of people, even in an email form, said, I'm not going to take this survey because I'm not farming. And we said, no, we want that information. That's precisely the information we need and want. But I think the perception, despite our best efforts to get people not to think that way, was that the survey was for folks who were still farming. It's clearly not the case. So we have some ideas for how to do that. That's more the same data, just in different form. How important are the following topics to running a new farm business? For us, this revealed that things like training and technical assistance and access to land, viewed as extremely important, are things that we do. Here's a reinforcement of some of the key features of our incubator program as being viewed as very important or extremely important among participants. This is more of a short-term reveal, right? Increase in knowledge during your time on the incubator. This is a short-term outcome. And it shows us that crop production was one of these things that folks really learned a lot from being here. And then we see in the future, in other questions, that crop production actually rates very low on the things that they think they need to know going into running a small farm business. In other words, achieving knowledge of crop production is a relatively low barrier to continuing a farm business, but an important one to know, if that's not obvious. This is a slide, I think, that comes back to some things from our logic model. Some of the select long-term outcomes, desired outcomes, transformation of local regional food systems, a diverse set of producers in the community, mentorship and networking opportunities for folks who are post incubator, resilience in food systems. We had approximations for some of those, right? And demographic data. We attempted to ask people about their social capital and their networks, their relationship to other service providers, for example, and their relationship to others that they might have mentored or trained on their farm. What I want to just kind of reinforce here is that it's not easy to match survey questions to the long-term outcomes. And we'll inevitably kind of change some of our, I think, outcomes based on our ability to measure them. Because again, if you can't measure it, what's the point in saying you want to do it or saying that you want this to be an outcome? I'm going to gloss over this one, other questions for long-term outcomes. We did have some great open-ended quotes in response to questions about how did the incubator, for example, prepare you for paid work, volunteer, or personal activities in agriculture or food systems. This is a question and a series of questions that we gleaned from Cassius to try to understand what have been some of the impacts beyond farming among our alumni. And we had some really good responses. I like this second one here. It made me aware that my life was a life I was living when I was home was the best life. in other words, it kind of revealed certain understandings about the life they were already living this time on the incubator. Another question here, describe what you believe to be the most significant challenges to sustaining a farm business. Some really interesting responses about what it means to be an immigrant, trying to address or access financial resources, and a relationship to customers and consumers who may be more accustomed to interacting in a sort of food system that, other than the one being built by local small farms. This is a recap of some of the lessons from the first part: preparation, persistence, and perspective, reasons to do evaluation. And then I'll just end here on a few different notes for us. Some of the preliminary recommendations and next steps is to really emphasize the transition planning during our business class in advance of the incubator. Everyone needs to go through this business class. Transition planning has come up a lot in the responses. Enhance networking among incubators and other service providers. And that means, additional referrals to land access and farm financing organizations. How to make it more than just a referral and try to see some of those relationships to fruition is another issue. And structure more engagement with the Food Hub and farmer training at new entry for current and alumni incubators. I think sometimes the entrepreneurial spirit tends to overwhelm our desire to give folks a kind of structured learning experience, and we're still trying to find some of those balances. Next steps we're going to take here, we're still looking at adding a 1-question survey to all non-respondents to address issues of bias in the responses we did receive. Can we get everyone to answer the question, are you still farming? If that comes through, we could have it as a baseline to say, okay, well, maybe our responses are slightly biased towards people who are still farming, and that's why they responded. So that's the thing we might do. Want to do a survey and focus group, basically similar methodology with our current incubators. There are 16 of them, and do that to really try to better understand the short-term outcomes. We'll focus on disseminating these results soon, so this is all preliminary, but hopefully you all will see something relatively soon that puts this into a more nice package with some final results. And it's also inspired us to think about other programs, specifically our internship program. New Entries had a long history of working with students at Tufts, and we would love to know how that experience of working with New Entry informed their future career trajectory. So that's another thing that we'll be undertaking this year, is to essentially look at the incubator as inspiring the next generation of farmers, and maybe our internship program and work with Tufts as inspiring the next generation of food system leaders. And hopefully evaluating those programs will both allow us to do more impactful work in the future in both those domains.
And Kathleen had a question, if you could talk a little bit more about bias and how you recognize it.
Terrific. Well, and thanks everybody. Sorry, I rushed at the end, but as it happens. So again, one of the ways that we don't really know if there's bias until we can understand something about the non-respondents to see if that group represents something different than the group that did respond. So this is the 1-question survey idea, where we're hoping that lowers the bar to respond, and it can give us some indication of whether or not the group that did respond is skewed in some way, at least with that one metric. Because if it's skewed in that one metric, it might be skewed in others. So it's imperfect, but that's one of the ways we're doing it. For demographic data, we also look back at some of the other records we had on non-respondents to see if the demographic data of who responded, which I didn't talk about, I realize, looks different than those who did not. Because we do happen to have some demographic data of non-respondents. So we'll also look at that to see if the demographic data of respondents is biased. That's what I got. Other sort of questions or things, maybe Jan or Jennifer, that you've noticed coming up in the chat that are worth talking about, or I don't know, can folks take themselves off mute to ask a question? Is that a possibility?
We have a kind of a question for everyone that Gabby put out, that if surveys are a convenient tool for evaluators, but given the low rate of responses and the time invested in people engaging with the surveys, what would be another evaluation tool that can be user-friendly and useful to measure evaluation objectives? And for me, it depends, again, on what you're trying to do. And I really loved what Jennifer shared, what they do. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that, because it really is more relationship building and in person. Again, that's could be a little harder to do in this kind of long-term follow-up situation, but for more medium-term outcomes for what happened as a result of the program at the end of a multi-year or several year, 2 years later, these can be really fabulous things to do.
I'll just say, I mean, historically, New Entry has worked with a lot of immigrant and refugee farmers that, speak multiple languages as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the way we used to do our annual farmer alumni survey, it was challenging, but we would take opportunities to have kind of group meetings during the winter months after the end of the season. We'd have an end of season potluck celebration. We would put sticky notes on the wall with key questions, with translation, and people could go put sticky dots, like even just to get people to say how much money they earned that year. Like that was an example of a quantitative question. We would have a dollar range of like, did you make $1,000 to $5,000 or $5,000 to whatever? And they could put a sticky dot next to it. So it was very anonymous. So we could ask some quantitative questions that way, as well as just get people's general feedback about what are things that they wish we were doing more of, or what would they like to see more of for next year. And then we kind of turn those into our annual food hub meetings as well, where we would do a whole report back to be very transparent as a program while we're building trust with the farmers to be, buying and selling their product and making sure we're being fair. We would do our annual, here's the evaluation from the customers, here, our customer survey of satisfaction results. Here's our financials. Here's how much we bought from you. Here are the top earning farmers, and we'd anonymize the list so they could see what the possibilities were and be clear, and then get their feedback again of like, how can we improve the program? So there are lots of kind of food-based, potluck-based evaluations that we could dive into in a more conversational basis, I guess I would say. And then last year over Zoom, Kevin, we had our incubator farmer meeting. We did like a little, polls and, surveys in the meeting on Zoom. And then farmers were actually talking to each other and realizing that they probably should be taking advantage of, their time with each other more. And like, we should do this more often. And so we're just trying to get those kinds of more qualitative input from everyone.
I'm a big fan. Somebody did this in a Zoom last year of saying, we're going to do a survey right now. Like, go ahead and take the next 5 to 10 minutes in this call where we happen to all be in the same place. And we've carved out this time for you to go ahead and take that survey. And I think that, our response rate for our preseason survey among our incubators was 100. We had 100% because we did it during a meeting that was required for them to attend. So it was effective.
Yeah, and I think, Gabby, to your question about, are farmers involved in developing the evaluation objectives? I would say we probably haven't done a great job of like engaging the farmers in designing, like, what did they want to learn about out of the program, or what do they want to learn about broader outcomes around the program? And Kevin, I don't know exactly what you guys talked about in the focus groups, if that would inform a future evaluation. If we got feedback from people completing this evaluation of how they would want to have seen it done differently moving forward, or different questions they wished we had asked of them, or things like that.
Yeah, we got some input on the survey tool, but not so much on developing the objectives overall, right? Or even that logic model. So I think one of the things that we could take away from this too is saying, well, as we're thinking about revising our logic model, would it make sense to workshop some of those outcomes, those desired outcomes with farmers? Yes, I think it definitely would. And I can see us reaching out to current and some alumni that we're in closer contact with to say, does this make sense to you? Does this seem like something that would also be a goal of yours? Because again, if the farmers' goals and our program goals are misaligned, that's an issue. But when they, I think, do start to come together, then you're on the right track.
And I would say too, I think to someone's point earlier is like, I think one of the challenges of doing this long-term outcome is like, how do you measure each person's individual goals, and did they meet their own goals versus what the program overall wants to achieve, and then how do you hold both of those at the same time? And I think that's the ultimate question. Like, yeah, everybody is a snowflake, and and everybody has their own personal reasons for farming and why they started the business, and like trying to capture that, and then trying to capture what your program goals are too, is that we want to transform the food system and have, you know, good use of stewardship of the land, all these other, you know, yeah, individual, social, and community goals that we talked about in that nested diagram. I think is challenging to get at all of them in one survey instrument or process.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you, Jennifer and Kevin, so much for doing this. This has been so great. But we're now at 11:01 Pacific time, so we're out of time. We've got a survey